My name is Wesley Whitmore. I'm 61 years old, and I have never once raised my voice at my son. Not when he wrecked my truck at 17, not when he dropped out of college for 8 months, not even when he stopped calling for 6 weeks because his girlfriend, now his wife, told him I was toxic. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe is the one moment in my life where every instinct I had screamed at me to stand up and fight back, and I didn't. I stood up, straightened my tie, took my wife's hand, my wife, who was standing there with her cheek still stinging in front of 400 people, and I walked out of my son's wedding reception without a single word. My family thought I'd lost my mind. Kayla and Brandon thought they'd won. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. It means more than you know. Now let me take you back to where this really started. 35 years in commercial construction teaches you one thing above everything else. The foundation is the only thing that matters. You can dress up any building with glass and chrome and a lobby that makes people stop and stare, but if the foundation is wrong, none of it holds. I've built a lot of things in this life. I started as a laborer at 22, worked my way up to foreman, then project manager, then eventually started my own contracting firm. Nothing flashy, no corporate office with a view, just work, honest, reliable work, and a reputation that took 35 years to build. My wife Carol is 59. We met at a church social in the fall of 1991, and I drove 4 hours to take her to dinner on our third date because she mentioned once that she loved a particular Italian place 2 counties over. We've been married 32 years. She spent most of that time teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school 12 minutes from our house. She retired 2 years ago. She cries at commercials, keeps a garden bigger than our living room, and has never once, not once, spoken a cruel word about anyone in my presence. Our son Brandon is 30 years old. He's smart, driven. He started his own interior design and project management firm 3 years ago, and I was prouder of him that day than the day he graduated college. I helped him, not financially, not in any way he'd ever see on paper, but with advice, with contacts, with showing up whenever he needed someone to bounce ideas off. I picked my battles when it came to Brandon. That was my policy, and it started the year he turned 22. He'd made a decision I knew was wrong, a business partner who wasn't who he said he was. I confronted it head on, hard, the way my father would have done. Brandon didn't speak to me for 3 months. When he came back, I swore to myself I'd learn to choose my moments. What I didn't understand then, what took me 30+ more years to finally see, was that every battle I chose not to fight was teaching my son that I'd never really fight at all. And Kayla had studied that lesson very, very carefully. Brandon brought Kayla home for the first time on a Sunday evening in October, about 2.5 years before the wedding. She was 25, beautiful in the kind of way that made you understand immediately why my son had that particular look on his face, like he was holding something he wasn't sure he deserved. She walked in with her hand in his, smiled at me, and shook my hand firm, confident, direct. With Carol, it was different. Carol had made pot roast. She'd set the table with the good plates, and when Kayla walked into the kitchen, Carol opened her arms, like she always does, warm and immediate, and Kayla offered a cheek, stiff, a single pat on Carol's shoulder. Carol didn't say anything about it later. She never does. I noticed something else that night. Kayla looked at me the way you look at a door to figure out whether it has a lock on it. Quick, professional, assessing. She wasn't rude. She was never technically rude. But there was a calculation behind her eyes that I couldn't shake. My sister Diane had driven up that weekend. She cornered me in the kitchen after dessert, voice low. "Wesley, she's sizing you up. Diane, you've known her 4 hours." "I know. That's enough." She poured herself more coffee. "Don't let yourself get managed out of your own family." I told her she was being harsh. I told myself she was being protective, the way she always was with me, the way she'd been since we were kids. A few months later, Brandon mentioned casually, no particular reason, just conversation, that before that first dinner, Kayla had asked him what his parents owned, what they earned, what kind of accounts they kept. I filed it away. I didn't act on it. That was my second mistake. The first was telling Diane she was wrong. The next 2 years were what I can only describe as death by 1,000 courtesies. There's no single moment I could point to and say, there, that's where it started. It was always just slightly off, always just within the range of things you could explain away if you wanted to badly enough. Kayla forgot to mention Carol's birthday dinner until the afternoon of the day itself. Twice. When Carol told stories at the table, she had good ones, 30 years of 8-year-olds. Kayla would drift, check her phone, turn slightly away. Nothing you could call her on, just enough to make Carol stop mid-sentence and lose the thread. She stopped talking to Carol directly. Somewhere around month 6, Kayla began routing everything through Brandon. Tell your mom we won't make it Sunday. Let your parents know we'll be late. Brandon became the wire between two poles that were never allowed to touch. And Carol, my Carol, who never asks for anything, started arriving at family dinners with an apology already built into her posture. She'd second-guess what she was going to say before she said it. She'd look at me across the table sometimes with this expression that asked, "Am I doing this wrong?" That was the thing I could never forgive. Not what Kayla did to me, what she did to Carol's ease in her own family. When Brandon called to tell us he and Kayla were engaged, Carol cried happy tears and started planning a dinner to celebrate. I sat on the back porch for a while before going back inside. 2 days later, I got a call from my old friend Marcus Webb, checking in before the holidays. He'd heard about the engagement from a mutual friend. "You sound quiet, Wes," he said. "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" "Whether I've been patient or whether I've been absent. I'm not always sure they're different things." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Ask me again after the wedding." The stands threw the engagement party 3 weeks after the ring. A nice restaurant downtown, the kind with cloth napkins that cost more than our first car payment. The invitation arrived 4 days before the event. Not emailed, not called. A printed card slipped under our door, like a notice from a landlord. Carol pressed it flat on the kitchen counter and said nothing. We went, of course. "You go." Sandra Stanton greeted us near the entrance. Pearls, silk, a smile that said, "How nice of you to come," in a way that made clear we were guests, not family. She introduced us to 3 different people in the first 10 minutes and gave our names wrong twice. Not maliciously, simply because she hadn't bothered to practice them. Our seats were at a table near the kitchen entrance, table 9. You could hear the pass-through window every time a dish went up. During the toasts, Kayla's father spoke for 8 minutes about the Stanton family legacy, about Kayla's accomplishments, about what a wonderful future the couple would build. He mentioned Brandon twice, warmly, genuinely. He did not mention us. Kayla came to our table near the end of the evening. She touched Carol's arm. "Thanks so much for coming, Mrs. Whitmore." The same tone you'd use for a neighbor who'd brought a casserole. I excused myself to find the restroom. On my way back through the hall, I passed a small alcove where Sandra was speaking quietly to one of her friends. "At least Brandon's ambitious. The father seems like he never left the job site." I stood there for a moment. Then I adjusted my jacket and walked back to our table. I didn't tell Carol what I'd heard. I just reached under the tablecloth and held her hand for the rest of the evening. But I remembered every word. 3 months before the wedding, the venue stage contractor fell through. It happens. Wrong specs, double booking, somebody's license wasn't current. Brandon called me on a Wednesday night, voice tight. He needed someone who could mobilize a crew fast, get the rigging right, make it look like nothing had gone wrong. He asked me not to mention it to Kayla. I called in a favor from a subcontractor I'd worked with for 15 years. 48 hours later, the stage was set, up to code, better than what they'd originally ordered. No invoice, no announcement. 2 weeks later, Brandon called again. Different tone this time. "Dad, Kayla found out." "Found out what? That I fixed the stage problem you asked me to fix?" "She feels like you went around her." I let that sit for a moment. "Brandon, you called me. I helped." I know, Dad, but she feels like you're overstepping, like you're trying to make yourself necessary." I heard something in his voice that I recognized. It was the careful flatness of a man reciting a script he didn't entirely believe. "Can you just back off?" he said. "Please, just until after the wedding." "All right," I said. "I'll back off." I hung up. Carol was at the kitchen table. She didn't ask, and I didn't explain. I sat by the window for a while. Not angry exactly. Something closer to grief. The slow-moving kind that you don't notice until you're already deep in it. That evening, Marcus Webb called out of nowhere. "Just checking in," he said. He'd heard the wedding was coming up fast. "You sound tired, Wes." "Ask me after the wedding, Marcus." "You said that before." "I know." A long pause. Then Marcus, steady. "Whatever you need, I'm here." "I know you are." The rehearsal dinner was 60 people in a private room at the Stanton's preferred restaurant. White linen, candles, a slideshow screen set up at the far end. The slideshow ran for 12 minutes. I counted their family photos. 21. Kayla and Brandon at the beach. Brandon and Kayla's father at a golf weekend. Kayla at her college graduation, her sister's wedding, a charity gala I'd never heard of. Not one photo of Carol. Not one of me. Not one of Brandon before Kayla. Carol sat beside me and watched all 21 slides with the same small, careful smile she uses at parent-teacher conferences when a parent is upset. The smile that says, "I'm fine. This is fine." When Brandon stood to speak, he thanked his groomsmen by name. He thanked the Stanton family, then his closest friends. Then, near the end, like a footnote, and of course, Mom and Dad, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. The same thing you'd say to a coworker who showed up to cover a shift. I stood when Brandon finished. I crossed the room and shook his hand. Pulled him in close enough that only he could hear me. "I love you. I always will. But there's going to come a moment when you'll have to decide what kind of man you are. Not for me, not for Kayla, for yourself." He looked at me. He didn't understand. Across the room, Kayla watched us with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not concern, not guilt. Something more calculating, like she was revising a plan. On the drive back to the hotel, Diane called. "Wesley, I heard Kayla tell one of her bridesmaids she was going to handle the Carol situation tomorrow, for good." I stared at the highway ahead. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, because I knew, one way or another, tomorrow was the last day things could stay the way they were. Saturday morning. The hotel room smelled like ironing, and the coffee Carol had made at 6 because neither of us was sleeping past 5:30 anyway. I was knotting my tie in the bathroom mirror when Carol appeared in the doorway in her dress. Slate blue. The one she'd driven 40 minutes to find. The one she'd tried on 4 times before buying because she wanted to make sure it was right. She looked at herself in the mirror beside me for a moment. "Do I look okay?" I set down the tie and turned to face her. 32 years, the same question before every school recital, every holiday dinner, every moment that mattered. I crossed the room and straightened the small corsage she'd pinned near her shoulder. "You look like the woman I drove 4 hours to take to dinner. You always have." She smiled. Then the smile faded just at the edges. "Promise me today will be okay, Wes." I looked at her, at the care she'd put into this morning, this dress, this attempt to be exactly the right kind of mother-in-law at her son's wedding. "I promise we'll handle whatever happens together." It wasn't what she'd asked for. She knew it. She nodded anyway. Before we left, I picked up my phone and typed a short message to Marcus Webb. "If I call you today, pick up." His response came back in under a minute. Always. The venue was 20 minutes from the hotel. When we pulled into the parking lot, I spotted Kayla near the entrance in her gown, speaking to her mother. She saw us arrive. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She looked at Carol the way you look at a problem you've already decided how to solve. My jaw tightened. I got out, opened Carol's door, and offered her my arm. "Let's go," I said. 400 people fill a ballroom differently than you'd expect. It's not just the noise, it's the weight of all that witness. The chandeliers overhead were the size of small boats, throwing amber light across round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces that probably cost more than my first truck. Somewhere near the front, a string quartet played something I didn't recognize. Our table was number 7, near the rear door, the one that led to the catering corridor. I pulled out Carol's chair. Diane had already found her seat beside us, and she squeezed my arm without saying anything. I looked at the table layout card. Brandon and Kayla's sweetheart table was at the far end of the room, flanked by the Stantons on one side and a wall of coordinated floral arrangements on the other. Between us and them, 6 full tables, 400 people, and the kind of social geometry that makes a message without saying a word. The ceremony was short, traditional. Brandon looked handsome and nervous in the way grooms always do, that particular combination of joy and terror. He glanced back once during the processional, a single look toward our table. One look. Then he turned back to Kayla, and I understood that was probably all we were going to get. Afterward, at the cocktail hour, a man at our table leaned over and asked what I did. I told him, commercial contracting, 35 years. He nodded, the way people nod when they've heard what they expected and lost interest. Then he pivoted away to speak to the man beside him. Carol reached for my hand under the table. I let her take it. I sat there in my good suit, at table 7, next to the kitchen door, and I thought, this is what we've been reduced to in our own son's life. I was wrong about one thing, though. We hadn't been reduced. We'd been positioned. And Kayla wasn't finished. The reception opened with toasts and dinner, the usual choreography. Kayla moved through the room table by table, a bride's tour of her kingdom, touching shoulders, accepting compliments, managing the room the way someone does when they've thought about it in advance. She reached our table last. She didn't stop. She slowed, briefly, and looked past Carol toward Diane, gave a small wave at no one in particular, and kept moving. Sandra Stanton made up for it. She appeared at Carol's shoulder about 10 minutes later with a glass of champagne and the warmth of someone running for local office. Carol, darling, your dress is lovely. A beat. Very sensible. Sensible. Not beautiful, not elegant. Sensible. Like a pair of walking shoes. Like a choice made by someone who didn't know any better. Thank you, Carol said. She said it like she meant it. She said it like she always does. With no armor, no edge, just open, because that's who she is. I set down my fork. Diane leaned over to me and murmured, Wes, we can leave after dinner. There's no rule that says, we're his parents, I said. We stay. Across the room, Brandon was laughing at something one of his groomsmen had said. He looked genuinely happy, genuinely at ease. I watched him for a moment, trying to find the 22-year-old who used to call me from job sites just to say he'd learned something new that week. Then Kayla broke away from a cluster of guests near the head table. She walked toward us. Not the wide, social walk she'd used with everyone else. This was direct, deliberate. She pulled out the empty chair across from Carol and sat down. The look on her face was not a smile. It was an ending. Kayla folded her hands on the tablecloth. Her voice was low. Not quiet out of discretion, but the way a person speaks when they want to be heard clearly by the people immediately around them, without appearing to shout. Carol, I think we need to talk about some things. Carol set down her water glass. Of course, Kayla, whatever you need. What followed was a list, delivered evenly, without visible emotion, which somehow made it worse. Kayla said that Carol had overstepped when Wesley arranged the stage contractor. She said it as though Carol had been the one who called. She said Carol had been putting pressure on Brandon, creating emotional obligations he felt he couldn't refuse. She said Carol had been telling people at the rehearsal dinner things about Kayla that weren't flattering. Carol's face went very still. Kayla, I'm not finished. The table beside us had gone quiet. I just want us to be clear, Kayla continued, about what our relationship looks like going forward. Brandon and I need space to build our lives, and that means boundaries. Carol nodded slowly. I understand. I'm sorry if I've ever... She was apologizing. Again. Apologizing for something she hadn't done, in the way she'd been trained by 100 small moments to do automatically. I put my hand on the table. Calm. Deliberate. Kayla, that's not what happened with the contractor. Brandon asked me... She turned to me, sharp. I'm speaking to Carol. The table next to us had definitely stopped talking. Across the room, 10 feet back, standing near the bar, Brandon was watching. He had heard. He had seen. His glass was halfway to his mouth and frozen there. He did not move toward us. I looked at my son across 40 feet of hardwood floor and white linen and chandelier light, and I didn't recognize him. Carol began to stand, graceful, quiet, the way she does everything. Kayla, maybe this is better saved for another time. Today is your... No. Kayla rose with her. Her voice had climbed 1 register, not screaming, but audible now to 2 tables, maybe 3. We talk about this now. I'm tired of this being pushed off. She turned toward the room slightly, as though drawing it in as witness. I know you've been talking to people here, saying things about me. I know. Carol's voice was very quiet. That isn't true. Don't tell me what's true. Kayla stepped forward. 1 step. Just 1. You've been trying to undermine me in my own marriage since the day Brandon brought me home, and I am done pretending. She slapped Carol across the face. Not a glancing blow. Not a shock of contact and nerves. A real, deliberate slap. The kind that turns a head. That leaves a sound hanging in the air like a bell that won't stop ringing. The string quartet stopped. The room went from 400 people talking to 400 people holding their breath in approximately 1 second. Then Kayla straightened. She looked at Carol, at the red mark rising on my wife's cheek, and her voice carried clean and clear across that suddenly silent ballroom. "Get out of here, old woman. Nobody wants you here. This is our day." Brandon was still standing at the bar. He set his glass down on the counter, slowly. He looked at his mother, at the mark on her face, at Kayla standing there like a verdict had been delivered, and he said nothing, not one word. Diane was already on her feet beside me. I put my hand on her shoulder. "Diane," I said, quietly, "sit down." I stood up. The room was still holding its breath. 400 people trying to decide whether to look or look away, and most of them choosing wrong. I walked around to Carol's side of the table. I took the white cloth napkin from beside her plate and held it gently against the side of her face. Not because she needed it, not because there was anything to wipe away, but because she had just been struck in front of 400 strangers, and she deserved at least one moment of being tended to. She let me. I set the napkin down. I helped her to her feet. I straightened the corsage near her shoulder the same way I'd done in the hotel room that morning. Then I buttoned the middle button of my jacket, turned slightly, and looked at the room. Not at Kayla, not at Sandra. I looked at the room itself, the tables, the faces, the people who had just watched my wife get hit and would have to decide for the rest of their lives what they thought about that moment. I found Brandon across the floor. He was looking at his shoes. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that eventually he looked up. "We'll talk later, son." 4 words, no anger in them, no trembling, just the particular weight of something being decided. I offered Carol my arm. She took it. We walked out. Near the back of the room, past table 3, an older man in a dark suit caught my eye as we passed. He gave me a single, slow nod, the kind that means I saw it, all of it. I nodded back. Outside, the night air was cool, and the parking lot was quiet, and my wife was shaking very slightly against my arm, and I held on to her and did not say a single word until she was ready. Diane found us by the car 10 minutes later. She didn't ask any questions. She just stood there in the October night, in her good heels on the asphalt, and kept Carol company while I sat on the hood of the car and looked at the sky. Carol was the first one to speak. "Why didn't he?" She stopped, started again. "Brandon, why didn't he say anything?" Nobody answered her. There was no answer that would help. I got up and opened the passenger door. "Let's get you inside." In the car, Diane sat in the back. None of us said much. The hotel was 20 minutes away, and I drove the whole stretch without the radio. Halfway there, Carol reached over and put her hand on mine. "I don't want to lose him, Wes." "I know. Promise me we won't lose him." I kept my eyes on the road. We're not going to lose Brandon, but we're going to have to decide what we're willing to accept in order to keep him. And I'll tell you right now, it's not this. It can't be this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned to look out her window. At the hotel, after Diane had gone to her own room and Carol had gotten into bed, I sat in the chair by the window with my phone. The city outside was ordinary and indifferent, which felt right. I opened Marcus's name and called. He picked up on the second ring. "Marcus, do you remember the conversation we had last year about the Meridian project?" A pause. "I'm in the parking lot behind the venue, Wes." His voice was careful. "I saw everything. You want to tell me what you need?" "There are things your children don't know about you, not because you hide them, just because they never asked." Marcus Webb and I met freshman year of college, 1982. He studied civil engineering. I studied construction management. We played poker on Thursday nights, split gas on road trips, and called each other after every significant thing that happened in the next 4 decades. His divorce, my father's death, Carol's cancer scare in 2009 that turned out to be nothing. He was at every milestone, always exactly as reliable as a good foundation wall. He'd spent the last 15 years building a regional real estate development company that had grown considerably past what either of us would have predicted in 1982. His firm was currently leading the Meridian project, a mixed-use commercial complex, 200,000 square feet, the largest development in the county in 20 years. They were in the final stages of selecting specialty subcontractors. 3 months ago, Brandon had submitted a proposal for interior design and project coordination for Meridian. He'd called me excited about it, his biggest pitch yet. He didn't know Marcus was on the selection committee. He'd never thought to ask what Marcus did. I hadn't told him. Not to keep a secret, there was just never a reason yet. In the parking lot that night, Marcus and I talked for 30 minutes. He told me the committee had been impressed with Brandon's technical work, but the final stage involved character and network vetting. The committee wanted to know who they were working with, beyond the portfolio. "What do you want me to do, Wes?" Marcus asked. I thought about Carol's cheek, about Brandon at the bar, glass halfway to his lips, frozen, saying nothing. "I don't want you to hurt him," I said. "I just need you to stop covering for him the way I have. Let whatever's going to happen, happen." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Understood. That was all. Brandon called at 11:17 that night. The phone buzzed on the nightstand and Carol stirred. I picked it up and took it to the bathroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the tub. "Dad." His voice had the careful evenness of a man who had rehearsed his first sentence. "I think we should talk about tonight." "All right, I'm listening." Kayla was under a lot of stress. The whole day it was a lot. She didn't mean it the way it came out. She's going to call Mom tomorrow and apologize. I didn't say anything. "Dad, she wants to fix this." "Brandon, your wife struck your mother, across the face, in front of 400 people. I kept my voice level. And you stood there." The pause that followed told me I'd landed exactly where I needed to. "I know," he said, finally, quietly. "I need you to understand that before we talk about Kayla's intentions or her stress level or what she's going to do tomorrow, I need you to sit with what you did and didn't do tonight. That's not fair." "It's very fair. Call me when you're ready to talk about that part, not before." I ended the call and sat on the cold edge of the tub for a while. Through the thin hotel bathroom door, I could hear Carol's breathing settle back into sleep. On the other side of town, I found out later, Kayla had taken Brandon's phone from his hand the second the call ended. She'd scrolled through the screen, nodded once, set it face down on the nightstand. She wasn't worried. She'd seen how this went before. Wesley Whitmore would cool down. He always did. She had no reason yet to think this time was different. Sunday morning, Brandon called at 8, then 9:15, then 9:40. I let all three go to voicemail. Carol's phone rang just after 10. She was sitting across from me at the small hotel table with her coffee, still in her robe. She looked at the screen, Kayla, and then looked at me. "Your call," I said. She set the phone face down on the table and wrapped both hands around her mug. 15 minutes later, a text from Brandon. "Dad, Kayla is sorry. She wants to talk. We all need to talk. Please." I typed back, "When you're ready to talk about what happened, not to explain Kayla, but to talk about what happened, call me." No response for 4 hours. Diane joined us for breakfast at a place down the street. Eggs, strong coffee, a window booth that looked out over an ordinary Sunday morning. People walking dogs, a kid on a bike. The world entirely unaware that anything had ended or begun. "How are you actually doing?" Diane asked. "Not great," I said, "but better than I expected." She nodded. That was enough. When we got back to the hotel, I opened my email. There was a message from Marcus, sent that morning at 7:12. The Meridian Selection Committee was meeting Monday. Brandon's firm was still on the short list. The committee had questions about references and professional network. Marcus would be present for the discussion. He hadn't asked me what to do. He'd simply told me the facts. I read it twice. Then I closed my phone and looked out the window at the Sunday afternoon beginning to arrive. For the first time in years, I didn't reach for the phone to make a problem go away. I let it sit. I let it breathe. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like the right thing. They showed up Monday morning without calling. I heard the car in the driveway from the kitchen. Carol was at the counter. She looked at me. I dried my hands. Brandon had his jaw set the way he does when he's braced for something. Kayla was in a white blouse, composed, deliberate. She'd dressed for this. We sat in the living room, no coffee offered. That was new. Kayla folded her hands in her lap and looked at me directly. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology for my behavior on Saturday. I'm sorry if what I said caused pain. Sorry if. The room was very quiet. Kayla, I said, a conditional apology isn't one. Sorry if it hurt is not the same as I was wrong. She held my gaze. I'm not sure what more you want me to say. Then I'll be specific. You struck my wife across the face, in front of 400 people. You told her nobody wanted her there. And your husband, my son, said nothing. What I want is for you to understand what those things actually were. Not to make me feel better about them, to actually understand. Brandon started. Dad, this isn't your conversation right now, Brandon. Kayla's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. So what does that mean for us going forward? What are you planning to do? I looked at her, level. Nothing dramatic. What it means is that Carol and I have changed what we're available for, and those changes won't be negotiated in a Monday morning living room. You'll see what they look like over time. She searched my face for the anger, the hurt, the leverage. There wasn't any. They left 20 minutes later. Kayla walked out with her shoulders back, still performing. But at the door, for just a moment, she glanced back at me. She wasn't sure anymore, and she knew that I knew it. Marcus called me Monday at 4:15. The committee met this afternoon, he said. Brandon's technical submission is solid. Good instincts, solid presentation. A pause. Then they asked me about the family, professional network, character background, the usual. What did you tell them? The truth. I told them I've known Wesley Whitmore for 43 years, and he is the most principled person I've worked alongside in this industry. Then they asked if I had the same confidence in his son. I was quiet. I told them I hadn't worked with Brandon directly, that I didn't have enough first-hand knowledge to vouch for him. In our industry, that answer has a specific meaning. Not a lie, not a smear, simply the absence of a recommendation from someone positioned to give one, and everyone in the room understands what that silence implies. They removed him from the shortlist, Marcus said. I want you to know I didn't say anything negative about him, not a word. I know, I said, and I want you to know I'd have made a call on his behalf a week ago if you'd asked. I didn't ask. No, Marcus said, you didn't. We stayed on the line for a moment. Are you all right, Wes? I'm figuring out what all right looks like from here. I looked out the window at Carol's garden. I'm not sorry. That's new. After we hung up, I sat with it. The weight of what had not happened. I hadn't engineered anything. I hadn't plotted or planned. I'd simply stopped being the cushion that caught my son before he hit ground. Brandon had always known I was there. He'd built his confidence on that knowledge. Now, he was going to have to find out what he was made of without it. That wasn't punishment. That was the most honest thing I'd ever done for him. Brandon called Tuesday evening. The tone was different from the first call. The rehearsed evenness was gone. What was left sounded like my son. Dad, we got the letter from Meridian. I heard. A long pause. Were you involved in that? I'd thought about how to answer this. I gave him the truth. I didn't do anything to hurt your chances. I didn't make a call against you, didn't say a bad word. What I did was not step in the way I normally would have. That's the same thing. No, it's not. But I understand why it feels that way. Silence. Then, you always stepped in, my whole life. I know. So why now? I looked at the kitchen wall for a moment. Because your wife hit your mother, and you stood there, and I had to figure out what it meant that I was still going to show up and smooth everything over. What that was teaching you. I paused. What it was teaching me. Brandon didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. What do I do now, Dad? That's the first honest question you've asked me in 2 years. I meant it gently, and I think he heard it that way. Figure out what kind of man you want to be. Not for me, not for Kayla, for yourself. What you stand for and what you won't stand for. That answer has to be yours. And if I figure that out, are we okay? We're always going to love you. That doesn't change. But okay is a process. It's not a light switch. He was quiet again. All right, he finally said. It wasn't enough. It wasn't everything. but it was the first brick of something we might actually build on. Kayla came alone on Thursday afternoon. I heard the knock and answered the door. She was in jeans and a light jacket, none of the careful costuming of Monday morning. Just her, and whatever she'd decided to say on the drive over. "You took away a major contract from my husband," she said. No preamble. "Because of what happened at the wedding. That's retaliation. Come in if you want to talk." "I'll say it here." She squared her shoulders. "You used your connections to punish Brandon because of me. That's what happened." "Kayla," I kept my voice even. "I didn't make a single call against your husband. I didn't contact anyone to work against him. What I stopped doing was going to bat for him the way I always have, which is a very different thing, and if you think about it clearly, you'll see that. You let him fail. I let him stand on his own. That's what parents are supposed to do eventually. You're punishing him for what I did. I'm done protecting him from consequences he's earned by the choices he's made, including the choice to stand at a bar and say nothing while his wife struck his mother." She stared at me, looking for the anger, for the moral uncertainty, for the opening she could use. "If you don't support us," she said, "you'll lose him." I looked at her for a long moment. She needed me to flinch. I didn't. "Kayla, I lost something I thought I had when I watched my son make his choice on Saturday night. Whatever comes next is built from here. That's up to Brandon and you, not me." I took a step back. "You don't get to tell me what my relationship with my son costs. That's not how this works." I closed the door, quietly, without drama, without a word more than was needed. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary after something irreversible. The coffee still brews, the mail still arrives, the garden still needs watering. But ordinary differently now, with new contours. Sandra Stanton called on Wednesday. I was outside. Carol took it. Sandra's message, delivered in the smooth vocabulary of someone who has mediated country club disputes, was essentially, enough time had passed, feelings had been expressed, and wouldn't it be better for everyone, most importantly for Brandon, if the adults could move past this and find a path forward together? Carol listened. Then she said, "Sandra, I don't need Wesley to forgive anyone right now. What I need is for my daughter-in-law to understand, not perform understanding, actually understand what she did. And I need my son to become the man I raised him to be. Neither of those things happen because we decide to be polite about it." There was a pause on the line. Then Sandra thanked her and said goodbye. Carol set the phone on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. Then she turned around, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, she looked completely at ease. Diane called that evening. Apparently, several of Brandon's friends who'd been at the wedding had been reaching out, quietly. Not organizing anything, not staging any kind of public response. Just people who had witnessed something and couldn't unknow it. 3 of them texted me separately, Diane said. "Wes, they all saw it. They're not going to forget it." I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't needed to. 400 people carry 400 memories. And then, 2 days later, I got an email from Brandon. Subject line, "Can we meet? Just us." We met at Riverside Park on a Thursday morning. Brandon was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench near the water with his hands loosely clasped, watching the current. He looked tired. Not the tired of one bad night, the tired of carrying something heavy for a long time and finally putting it down far enough away that he could see it clearly. I sat beside him. We didn't speak for a minute. "I knew," he said, "before the wedding. I knew Kayla had been building something against Mom. I saw it happening. I kept thinking it would level off." He looked at his hands. "I wanted it to level off, so I let myself believe it would." "That's not the same as not knowing." "No," he said, "it's not." The water moved past us. Somewhere behind us, a dog was barking at a jogger. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. I thought about it, actually thought about it, rather than reaching for the answer a father is supposed to give. "I love you." That doesn't have an off switch. But forgiveness is something you earn through action over time, not through asking for it. I looked at him. "I need to see who you are from here, not hear about it." He nodded, slowly. "Kayla and I are going to start seeing a therapist," he said. "I don't know where it goes, but I know I can't keep doing what I've been doing." "Good." I meant it. I stood up. He stood with me. We didn't hug. Neither of us was ready for that yet, and we both knew it. But I held his gaze for a moment. and what passed between us was more honest than anything we'd managed in the last 2 years. I walked back to my car alone. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, and then, for the second time that week, I let myself cry. 10 days after the wedding, a cream-colored envelope arrived for Carol, Kayla's handwriting on the front. Carol opened it at the kitchen table while I sat across from her with my coffee. She read it once, set it down, then read it again. I didn't ask. She handed it to me. It was 1 page, handwritten. This time, Kayla had used the word wrong. She said she had been wrong. She said that what she'd done had been harmful, and she took responsibility for it. She did not say she understood why, which was honest at least. Understanding takes longer. Carol sat with it for a while. Then she went to the small desk in the corner where she keeps her personal stationery, the cream kind with her initials pressed into the top, and she sat down and wrote back by hand. I read it when she brought it to me to review. It said, "Kayla, I received your letter. I'm glad you wrote it. I won't pretend the right words are easy to find, so I'll just say this. I hold no hatred toward you, but I can't pretend nothing happened, and I won't. When you're ready to have a real conversation, not to be forgiven, but to actually understand, I'm here for that. Take your time, Carol. No apology, no minimizing, no opening the door wider than the situation warranted." I handed it back to her. She looked at me. "Is it too much?" she asked. "It's exactly right," I said. She sealed it herself, walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, and dropped it in. When she came back in, she washed her hands at the kitchen sink and started making lunch like it was any other Thursday. But her posture was different, straighter, lighter. She'd stopped apologizing for existing. I don't know exactly when it happened, but there it was. I didn't say a word to anyone. I want to be clear about that. I didn't call in any favors, didn't make any pointed remarks, didn't email anyone's employer, or post anything anywhere. I went back to my life. Bids, site visits, early mornings, Carol's garden on the weekends. I was exactly as I had always been. But 400 people carry 400 memories, and communities are smaller than we pretend. About 3 weeks after the wedding, Diane mentioned that a woman from Kayla's yoga class had reached out to one of our mutual acquaintances. She'd been at the reception. She'd seen it. She couldn't stop thinking about it. A month later, I heard through a contractor I work with that Kayla's freelance design work, she styled homes for sale, mostly referral-based, had gone quieter than usual. No one was refusing her. The phone just wasn't ringing at the rate it had before. Referrals are built on trust, and trust lives in the same community where 400 people attended a wedding. Sandra Stanton appeared at a garden club luncheon that Carol attended. I heard about this from Diane, who heard it from Carol that evening. Someone had asked Sandra, directly, in front of others, whether the stories going around about the reception were true. Sandra had said, there was a misunderstanding. The table had gone quiet in exactly the way tables go quiet when no one believes the explanation, but everyone is too polite to say so. That was the sound of a reputation beginning to revise itself. I won't pretend there was no satisfaction in any of this, but satisfaction isn't the same as wanting it. People ask me sometimes if I feel like I got justice. I tell them I'm not in the justice business. I'm in the integrity business. Those are very different things. I want to pause here for a second, because a lot of you are probably asking the same question I was asking myself through all of this. Did I feel guilty? Did I wonder if I should have done more, or less, or something different? The answer is yes, every day. I don't think you get to watch your kid struggle, even when the struggle is of his own making, without that weight. But I've learned that guilt and responsibility aren't the same thing, and that doing nothing harmful is not the same as doing nothing at all. I want to ask you something before we get to the last part of this story. Have you ever been in a position where keeping the peace and keeping your dignity were two different choices? Where you had to pick? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because I think more of us have been in that room, or at that table, or at that wedding, than we ever admit out loud. Okay, let me tell you how this ends. 6 months later, Brandon and I have breakfast every other Saturday. Not at our house, not at his. We rotate through a short list of diners within a 15-minute drive. The kind of places with laminated menus and coffee that comes in those white mugs with the thick rims. We don't have an agenda. We talk about work, about the news, about whatever he's been thinking about. Sometimes we sit in comfortable quiet for 20 minutes, and that's enough. Kayla hasn't been to our house. That's the current boundary, and we've all quietly agreed to it without saying so out loud. They're still in therapy. Brandon mentions it without elaboration, and I don't press. What matters is that he's showing up for something difficult and staying in the room. His firm landed a smaller commercial project 2 months ago, a restaurant fit-out downtown. He'd gotten it on his own, through his own network, which I think he needed more than he knows. He called to tell me when the contract came through. He sounded different, not just happy, earned. I sat across from him one morning in October, almost a year since that first Sunday dinner when Kayla had shaken Carol's hand like a stranger's, and watched him talk about a design problem he was working through. His hands moved when he explained it. His eyes lit up. He sounded like himself. I thought, there he is. That's my son. Not fixed, not finished, not the version of himself that stands at a bar and says nothing while the world shifts under his feet, but working, growing, finding his footing on ground that now has to hold him on its own terms. That's not nothing. In fact, at 61 years old, I've come to understand it might be everything. People ask me sometimes why I didn't say anything in that ballroom. They mean it as a criticism, usually. Why didn't you stand up? Why didn't you defend her? Why didn't you say something to Kayla right there, in front of everyone, the way she deserved? Here's what I've come to understand about that moment. Anything I said would have become the story. Not the slap, not the 400 witnesses, not the mark on my wife's cheek or my son's silence. Me, my anger, my words, whatever I might have said in the white heat of that second. That would have been the image people carried out. I'd have handed Kayla exactly what she needed, proof that the Whitmores were the problem. So I straightened my tie, I tended to my wife, and I walked out carrying my dignity intact, which is the one thing no one could take from me unless I gave it to them. But I want to be honest about something else. The silence I chose that night was not the silence I'd been choosing for 2 years. Those are different. 2 years of overlooking, of not pushing back, of letting things slide in the name of keeping peace. That silence cost us. It cost Carol, it cost Brandon, who'd learned to read my patience as permission. The silence in the ballroom was a choice made with everything I had. The silence before it was something closer to a failure of nerve, dressed up as patience. The lesson I keep coming back to is this. You can absorb a great deal for the people you love, but there's a point where absorbing becomes something else entirely. It stops being love and starts being erasure. You are allowed to be there, fully, unashamedly there. Don't let anyone, not a daughter-in-law, not a social moment, not even your own habits, edit you out of your own family. Late August. The garden is at its best right now. The dahlias Carol started from tubers in April are finally doing what she said they would, which is take over every square foot she gave them and then quietly negotiate for more. I brought my coffee outside and sat in the chair by the patio edge on a Saturday morning, the way I do now whenever the weather allows. Carol was already out there in her wide-brimmed hat, moving through the beds with her clippers and her canvas bag, humming something I couldn't quite place. She didn't know I was watching. Or maybe she did. After 32 years, the line between knowing and not knowing a person gets very thin. She's different than she was a year ago. Not harder, not guarded or closed in, just less apologetic, less braced for impact. The woman who spent 24 months second-guessing everything she said at family dinners has been replaced, slowly and quietly, by the woman who wrote a letter on cream stationery and mailed it without asking anyone's permission. She looked up after a while, walked over and sat on the arm of my chair, which is too small for that, but she does it anyway. "You think Brandon is going to be all right?" she asked. I thought about the diner 2 weeks ago, his hands moving when he talked, the contract he'd earned. "I think he's figuring it out," I said, "and I think that's what has to happen." She considered that. "Good enough for now?" "Good enough for now." She patted my knee and went back to her dahlias. I sat with my coffee and the morning and the very ordinary, very hard-won piece of a life that had been tested and was still standing. It doesn't look like what I imagined. It's better, actually. Last week we were at the diner on Clement Street, the one with the photos of the town on the walls from 1952, back when the whole county looked like a different century. Brandon had been quieter than usual through most of breakfast. Not the careful quiet of managing something, just thinking. Working something out at his own pace, the way he does when something matters. He set down his fork after a while. "Dad, That day at the reception, when you got up and walked out, when you took Mom's hand and just left. He looked at me. I've replayed that probably 200 times. I waited. I thought I knew what kind of man I was. I had this whole idea of myself. He looked at the table. And then I watched you walk out of that room without saying a word, without making a scene, and I realized I had no idea what it actually took to be that. I thought being a man meant not backing down. Turns out, it means knowing when walking out is the harder thing. I didn't say anything for a moment. Kayla and I are still in therapy, he said. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I'm not going to be the person who stands at a bar anymore. I know, I said. He looked up. You know? I can see it. These mornings, I can see you working at it. He nodded. We paid the check and walked out into the late summer morning. Two men who have a long way still to go, and enough honesty between them now to make the trip. In construction, we say the foundation is everything. You can rebuild anything above it. We're laying new foundation now, one Saturday at a time. If you've been listening to this, all of it, there's something I want to say before I let you go. If you recognized yourself somewhere in this story, maybe as someone who's absorbed too much for too long, someone who's been at the table near the kitchen door, someone whose child has looked away at the wrong moment, I want you to hear this. You are not required to make yourself smaller to keep someone comfortable in your presence. Not even if that someone is your child. Not even if the room is full of 400 people watching to see what you'll do. Walking out is not giving up. Setting a limit is not the same as withdrawing love. These are the things I had to relearn at 61 years old, in a ballroom in October, with my wife's hand in mine. My name is Wesley Whitmore. I am still Brandon's father. We have breakfast on Saturday mornings. We are building something that took a long time to get honest enough to build. Carol's garden is full of dahlias. The Meridian project broke ground last month. I drove by the site and thought about foundations, the way I always do. Marcus and I have coffee once a month, and somewhere out there, a son is doing the harder work of becoming the man he should have been a year ago. Some bridges you rebuild. Some you just make sure you don't burn the ones that still stand. If this story stayed with you, if it gave you permission to draw a line you've been afraid to draw, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done? There are more stories like this in the description. I'll see you in the next one.